gentlemen. Thank you for your attendance. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the panel for their attendance as well. In order to hear as much from our witnesses as we can this morning, Mr. Conaway and I are going to have very brief opening statements. He has a very busy day, and I'm participating in the healthcare summit today at the Blair House, so I want to not walk in the middle of it late. I think that'd be a little bit of a problem. So succinctly, we have reached the decision-making point of our venture here, where we're beginning to put together our report to the American people and to the Congress and the full committee. And the purpose of today's hearing is to hear experts and leaders from three perspectives on procurement reform and workforce development. A perspective from those who've led businesses that have achieved in that area. Norm Augustine is someone who not only has led great companies, but is now the leader of an organization of leaders of great companies who try to contribute and have contributed to our national debate very positively and constructively. Professor Schooner is a returnee to our panel. He gave us very valuable insight early in our process, and he's back to help us today. And Mr. Joe Flynn is National Vice President of the American Federation of Government Employees. We know we will only succeed if the men and women who are committed to the institutions and agencies succeed. And so we want to be sure that our report is inclusive and takes into account those who know best the procurement process, the men and women who work with it. So we welcome the witnesses. At this point, I'm going to yield to my friend, the senior Republican on the panel, Mr. Conaway.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome. Glad to have you here this morning. And we are, as the Chairman said, we are not past the point of good ideas. We're still looking for good ideas, even though we do have a draft of the document. It looks pretty good. Nothing's perfect, and so any input that you give us this morning would be much appreciated. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And again, so we can hear more substance from the witnesses, I'm going to forego the usual reading of the biographies. We know and respect all three of you and appreciate the contributions you've made. I think you know from the rules here that your written statements without objection are being made part of the record of the hearing. We'd ask you to give us a 5-minute or so synopsis of your written statement, and then we're going to proceed to interaction with the members of the panel. So, Mr. Augustine, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Mr. Cooper and members of the panel, we appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of BEN's, the Business Executives for National Security, some of our thoughts on defense acquisition. And, as you probably know, BEN's is an organization made up of mostly former business executives, mostly from the commercial sector, some from the defense sector, who came together 28 years ago to offer advice to the government on areas where we may have any particular expertise. Last year it was my privilege to chair the BEN's task force on acquisition, and in July we issued a report, of which you, I believe, have a copy, that we offered 25 specific recommendations that we believe would improve the acquisition process. Today I would, in my 5 minutes, like to make just a few comments that I personally believe summarize the challenges that the process of acquisition still faces. And I appreciate your submitting or including my written testimony in the record. I would call to your attention as part of it an attachment that describes a canonical acquisition program gone wrong. And it's derived from my, goodness, 50 years, I guess, in this business. And it is a pretty good summary of why things go wrong. Secondly, I would like to provide for the record, just so that your committee will have it available if you don't, Dave Packard's 1969 statement, which is closely reflective of what we've included in our BEN's report. I'll provide that for the record.
Without objection, will be considered in the record.
Thank you very much. It was my privilege to work for Dave in those days, and I think he understood this process better than most anybody I've met since that time. Individuals participating in the defense acquisition process, of course, have a particularly great fiduciary responsibility. Not only do they take care of many billions of dollars of public money, but perhaps more importantly, the lives of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen depend on how well they do their job. And in fact, the very survival of our country could depend upon that. It's been my experience, having worked 10 years in government and the rest in the private sector, that the individuals in the defense acquisition process are in large part, overwhelming part, extremely dedicated, able people. Nonetheless, as you know, dissatisfaction with the defense acquisition process is rampant in all quarters. The process is complex, as you know. It revolves around 15-year programs and 5-year plans and 3-year managements, 2-year Congresses, 18-month technologies, 1-year budgets, and thousands of pages of regulations and laws. It is complex. But, you know, despite the serious shortcomings, it's still noteworthy that equipment and services provided by our acquisition process remain the envy of most of the world's military forces. But we can do better. We can do much better. Perhaps the best summary I've seen over the years of the failing of the acquisition process comes from Gil Fitzhugh's 1970 Blue Ribbon Task Force, in which they said that everyone is responsible for everything and no one is responsible for anything. I think that vividly summarizes the challenge that we face. Today, we have a large number of individuals, about 125,000 people. I calculate that to be the equivalent of 7 Army divisions running the acquisition process. In a few areas, we need additional people, particularly in contracting and systems engineering and program management. On the other hand, I would point out that adding, say, 10,000 people, each with 1 year's experience, is different from adding 500 people with 20 years' experience. And when I compare my experience in industry with government, at any given level, the biggest difference is not the talent level or the commitment level, it's the experience that's relevant to the job that's being conducted. Unfortunately, the government's hiring and employment practices make it very difficult to attract and keep the sort of talent that the government needs to conduct these difficult programs. I would also note that the United States no longer possesses a dominant position it once held with respect to technological leadership. That certainly has an impact on how we manage the defense acquisition process. U.S. firms have also moved much of their manufacturing capability abroad. And while I believe you could probably build an economy based on a service sector, I don't think you can win wars with purely a service sector. I would also note that the talent base within the U.S. is withering, particularly in engineering and science and mathematics. 2/3 of the PhDs that are granted in engineering today from U.S. engineering schools go to foreign individuals, many of whom are now returning home. During this period of burgeoning technology that we've been living in, astoundingly, the number of U.S. citizens studying engineering has dropped 20%. The number getting PhDs has actually dropped 35%. The report that Benz has prepared offers a series of recommendations, which I won't repeat at this point in order to keep my comments short. I would note that the great irony is that Secretary Gates and his colleagues, I'm sure, would prepare a quite comparable report. There's no great secret, I think, in terms of the nature of the problem we face. I would just close with a quote from Dave Packard, that I heard him make many times when I had the privilege of testifying alongside him over the years. And he made the comment that we all know what needs to be done. The question is, why aren't we doing it? And so let me, on behalf of my colleagues at Benz, particularly the members of the committee I chaired, thank you for this opportunity to share our views.
Thank you, and I think that what binds us together on this panel is that we do want to do what needs to be done and not just talk about it, and your contribution is very welcome and appreciated. Professor Schooner, welcome back to the panel. We value your participation as well.
Well, good morning, and I appreciate the opportunity to again discuss DoD's pressing need to invest in the acquisition workforce. As this group knows, the empirical case that DoD's workforce has been starved for a couple decades is now compelling. So that's the easy thing. This is obviously clear with regard to contracting officers and contract specialists, but as Norm pointed out, particularly acute with regard to program managers, systems integration, systems engineering, and those needs will need to be addressed. I think that the one thing that's very important for us to focus on today is the Defense Department is now on record saying they're going to add 20,000 new people in a couple different ways over the next 4 years. And I think what we need to keep in mind is it's great that they've at least begun the discussion, but we're talking about numbers that are too low, and we're talking about an evolution that's simply too slow. Just a number of reasons why 20,000 people by 2015 won't get the job done is the 1998 benchmark is fundamentally flawed. 1998 is at the end of a decade after which the congressionally mandated workforce cuts had been in place. There's been explosive procurement spending in the last decade. Procurement increased at the Defense Department 5 times the rate of inflation in the last decade. The dominance of service contracts today has totally changed the post-award contract management burden that DoD has to share. We have a looming retirement crisis. We tend to describe the acquisition workforce today as a bathtub effect. We have lots of senior people, lots of junior people, basically nothing in the middle, and we need to do something about that as well. In addition, what's basically happened over the last 15 years is because of the workforce problem, we have failed to effectively implement almost every significant acquisition reform that's been promulgated either by Congress or by the administration. The other thing to keep in mind is as DoD grows, this is not just DoD's problem. It's a government-wide problem. So as DoD finds people, trains them, and integrates them, they're going to start losing those people to the other agencies that have exactly the same problems and have historically taken highly skilled DoD acquisition workers rather than train them themselves. Now, Norm mentioned that right now, the workforce that's available, the marketplace, is saturated with people who would love to come work for the government. But the civil service and the OPM hiring process is flawed, it's burdensome, and the overall level of awareness of these opportunities on the nation's college and university campuses is inadequate. But at the end of the day, I think one of the most important things for us to keep in mind today is simply hiring people will not end this conversation. There's every reason to be pessimistic that even if DoD can hire all these people, they lack the vision, the institution, and the determinations to properly train, allocate, mentor, incentivize, develop, and over time retain all of these new professionals. I mean, there's a number of encouraging signs. If you look at the model at the Veterans Administration Acquisition Academy, granted, a very small model, it's a wonderful holistic approach to addressing some of these concerns. And there's a wonderful bill that's been introduced by Senators Collins, McCaskill, and Bennett. I think it's S2901, Acquisition Workforce Improvement Act. Again, a nice holistic approach, but there's going to take major change for DoD to actually be able to manage all of these people. Leadership is a problem. I think we have every reason to be skeptical at this point of DoD's newfound commitment to investing in the acquisition workforce. They've delegated this problem too long to the Defense Acquisition University. It's underfunded, it's overly conservative, it's been slow, risk-averse, and it's not sufficiently potent to solve the problems. I think that the message that we're getting from the White House very recently from the new OFPP administrator, Dan Gordon, is very encouraging. Time will tell whether he's actually been empowered to do anything about these things. But I guess I want to close with one really significant point here, and that is we've got to do something about the pervasive anti-contractor rhetoric that we hear because it colors the public's perception of contractors and the acquisition profession. There's more truth than there should be behind the black humor in Jack Gansler's popular new moniker for the current environment, which he calls the global war on contractors. Look, let's be clear. A successful procurement regime does depend on high standards of integrity and compliance. But the currently pervasive corruption control focus stifles creativity and encourages mechanical rule adherence, timidity, and risk-averse behavior by our acquisition professionals. If, in fact, the government aspires to recruit, inspire, and retain tens of thousands of new professionals, the government surely has an interest in communicating the importance to every government mission of effectively managing the government's business partners, its vendor and supplier base, or simply its contractors. So ultimately, any prospective investment in the DoD workforce, whether it's the numbers, the skills, or the morals of our purchasing officials, That will reap huge dividends over time. It's going to be good for the taxpayer. It's going to be good for the warfighter. It's got to be done. Thank you again for the opportunity to share these thoughts, and I'd be glad to answer questions later.
Professor, we look forward to that. Thank you very, very much. Mr. Joe Flynn is the AFGE District 4 National Vice President. He's new to our panel, but certainly not new to these issues. He has over 40 years' experience as an AFGE activist and officer holding numerous positions, and it's very, very much our pleasure to have you with us this morning, Mr. Flynn. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, especially since the National Personnel Security System has been repealed. Thank you all for that very nice gift to DoD employees. AFGE vigorously opposed NSPS from its conception until its repeal. The original NSPS included provisions to eliminate collective bargaining rights for DoD employees, eliminate employee rights to independent adjudication of severe disciplinary actions, including termination. These anti-union, anti-worker provisions were repealed in the 2008 NDAA, and last year, following evaluations, the so-called pay-for-performance scheme for NSPS employees was repealed. NSPS was tainted, it was a flawed system, and it clearly created a poisonous atmosphere, destroying collective bargaining, federal union, and employee rights and protections. Things that we do in the future, I would urge the members of the panel to make sure that these colossal mistakes are not repeated. Despite much rhetoric to the contrary, there are alternatives. And I'd like to go back to the general schedule. General schedule pay system is simple, it's transparent, it's flexible, and it's particularly adept at rewarding high performance among employees when proper funding is available. And that's the key, Mr. Chairman, proper funding. Within grade step increases, quality step increases, individual performance bonuses are all designed to promote individual excellence. Two additional constructs of the GS system are the best at motivating employees. First, we have what's known as career ladders, which allow an employee to progress from one grade to the next as part of the position for which they were hired and for which they competed. For example, an employee may begin working for an agency in a position which has a career ladder of GS5, moves to a GS7, to a GS9, culminating in the journeyman grade of a GS11. The career ladder is simple to pay banding, or similar to pay banding, except that under the career ladder, the criteria for advancement are known and understood by the employee and his supervisor. If the GS5 employee applies himself and achieves the performance standards required, then he progresses to the GS7. If he then achieves the performance standards for the GS7, he progresses to the GS9 up to the journeyman level of the GS11. The career ladder gives tremendous incentive to the employee to work hard and dedicate himself to the agency's mission. It assures that he will not find himself at a dead end. Along with career ladders, merit promotion, which occurs when an employee is eligible for and promoted to a different job at a higher grade rate. These are posted for all to see, and people are hired for these positions following a competition based on merit. This is not only transparent and honest, but a promotion is very public recognition of an individual's performance. The market elements of the GS system are based on pay studies and job matches done by the Labor Department's Bureau of Labor Statistics. The data are discussed in joint committee meetings with OMB, OPM, DOL, AFGE, and other unions. All employees receive the same national raise and a locality raise based on the regional labor market. AFG has successfully negotiated numerous contracts with group performance bonuses, gain sharing, During the mid-1990s, AFGE and DoD engaged in a successful 5-year demonstration project called Pacer Share, which made changes in organizational structure, created a new classification system, and implemented gain sharing and a different performance appraisal system. I'd like to emphasize, Mr. Chairman, that all these changes were conducted through collective bargaining agreements. AFGE is working with the Office of Personnel Management as it explores options to enhance and improve the GS system. We are discussing changes to simplify the appraisal process so that there are generally 3 categories of employees: those who are in good standing, those who are superstars, and those who are not performing at an acceptable level. AFGE has negotiated contracts with just these sorts of systems, and the results have been extremely favorable. There is agreement between the employees and managers that the system is fair, that involves less tedious and often less pointless paperwork, which in turn allows employees and their supervisors to focus on the work of the agency. Mr. Chairman, I realize how pervasive the perception is that the federal workforce is full of incompetents who are showing up late, if they show up at all, doing virtually nothing at all day long, and yet collecting a paycheck. Mr. Chairman, I can tell you in my experience, it's just not that way. Nobody believes more strongly than AFGE that where we have these types of employees that they need to be dealt with in a serious manner. It is important that hardworking rank-and-file employees are not forced to take up the slack for those who are intentionally unproductive. And AFGE certainly does not want to have those types of employees in the workforce. AFGE routinely negotiates contracts which simplify and expedite appeals for adverse personnel actions. The grievance arbitration process included in our contracts is transparent, impartial, and swift. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, in addition to our ongoing dialogue with OPM, AFGE is eager to work with DoD management to improve the performance management system as well as the hiring systems. And in that regard, we are working with OPM to try to streamline the hiring process. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Mr. Flynn, thank you very much. We will proceed with the questionings. Mr. Augustine, I was very much in agreement with your statement that you can't fight a war or defend a country with just service industries. I think that's very important, which implies the issue of how we create stability in our industrial base. One of the ways that the panel has looked at is the encouragement of more multi-year contracting and procurement so that our manufacturers have a better degree of predictability. As you well know, the risk of that approach is that you can wind up tamping down competition by giving one vendor too many years where it doesn't have to compete. What suggestions do you have for us as to how we can strike the right balance between multi-year contracting that promotes a stable or growing industrial base, but promotion of effective competition to protect quality and the taxpayer?
Well, you point to a true dilemma, and there are substantial savings to be had through multi-year contracting. At least the programs I've been involved with, that's been the case. At the same time, I think you have to distinguish between programs with large volume, if you will, very large programs where you might, and we also have to distinguish whether we're talking about service programs or production programs too.
Yes.
But where there's a sufficient volume of effort that you perhaps could keep 2 organizations involved. Unfortunately, that's very often not the case. And so when you do go to these long-term contracts, you pay a price. But as I say, my experience has been that you're well ahead to go to multi-year procurements in terms of cost, in terms of learning on the part of the supplier. And if it is something, though, where you can afford to have another firm in the background, that's a useful thing to do. Unfortunately, I don't think you can always do that.
Professor Schooner, if I wanted to ask you a different question, I think you justifiably are alarmed about unfair criticism of contractors. It's painting with a broad brush. where the small minority who are doing something wrong taint the image of the vast majority who are doing something right. Can you give us an example of a rule or practice that you think leads to the kind of timidity and lack of creativity that you cite in your testimony?
I think maybe more than anything else, if we were just to take an example and look at the messages that we're seeing from the Defense Contract Audit Agency right now. Historically, DCAA, when they found problems, their goal or their aspiration was to work with contractors to resolve the problems. The message that they are getting today, the risk-averse approach, is rather than solve the problems, it's to refer them to criminal investigative units. That's not going to get the government more value for money. It doesn't solve problems. It just leads to openly hostile relationships, and it's fundamentally problematic.
Do you think that there have been too many instances where there have been criminal referrals?
I think that it's always hard to say that we shouldn't be prosecuting criminals. I don't think there's any question about that.
Very hard to say that.
Right, but let's take the more proactive approach. There always seems to be enough money for inspectors generals and auditors, but there never seems to be enough money to proactively avoid the problems in the first place. This is what we learned in kindergarten. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we had invested the kind of resources up front in Iraq and Afghanistan in contracts professionals that we invested after the fact in auditors, inspector generals, look at the size of the SIGAR and the SIGAR. These are huge organizations.
Right.
Had we had contracting offices of that size at the beginning, we wouldn't have the criminals and the problems that we're dealing with now. So this is all about dealing with these problems proactively.
You're right, and the panel's mission in large part is that, I'll say when the next deployment not occurs, if, because there always is another one, that we have in place a system that could learn the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan and prevent the problems that we've had. We frankly don't want any more deployments, but we live in the world of reality and expect that we will have them.
Could I also just add one very brief thing?
Just
Norm?
briefly, if you would, because
Sure.
I want to be sure the other members get time.
I think that the point that Norm made is a very good one about dealing with long-term contracts. But again, one of the other things, if we can build up the acquisition workforce, we can put better incentives in the long-term contracts. We can use incentive and award fees so that the contractor has significant incentives to perform well and disincentives not to perform badly.
I do think
Once
that's a
again,
creative way to solve the dilemma that I posed in my question. I agree with you, which is
Labor-intensive.
not so much a matter, I think, of the number of professionals we have, but the quality of their training and the sufficiency of their motivation and incentive, which gets me to Mr. Flynn's point. I was very pleased. First of all, I appreciate your active involvement in our effort, and I was very pleased to read on page 7 your position on finding fair evaluative mechanisms that could put employees into categories of good standing, superstars, and those not performing acceptable level. How many of these contracts, if you know, have you been involved in negotiating across the country thus far?
I would say that that type of system you would find in the previous VA contracts, the Social Security contract, the Medicare contract. I don't believe very many DOD units have.
How old are the contracts in Social Security, Medicare, or VA? Do you know how long they've been in effect?
A good number of years, Mr. Chairman.
We'd be interested, I just asked the staff to, and invite the panel as well, to collect some data on how they've worked out in those agencies to see what the assets and liabilities of going about that is. Because I do think that it's refreshing to hear your testimony that you're actively involved in looking for a solution to this problem, of proper motivation and fair treatment of people that are part of our team. Well, thank you, and I would turn now to Mr. Conaway for his questions.
Kind of between Mr. Flynn and Professor Schooner, first off, what happens to the folks who are underperforming?
Well, the agency has 3 recourses. One is to reassign them, demote them, or terminate them.
How many of
In
them are
my experience, they've moved for the termination. The other 2 options usually are not considered.
So they don't hand them off to somebody else? Okay, that, if you could include that in the information. There's a story today that a high school in Rhode Island fired every teacher today because the school had just the most dramatically dreadful results of kids coming out. And they're going to go back through and hire the few good ones or the whatever. But Mr. Flynn, why hasn't that professional workforce that you guys represent fixed these problems?
You mean the underachiever, Mr.?
No, I mean, just all of the criticisms we hear about the acquisition deal, if everything's great under the GS scheme and all those things work perfectly, then why has that cadre of professionals not fixed the problems that we were talking about from 69 through today?
From my perspective, Mr. Chairman, there's a couple of things. Number one is the question of staffing. Clearly, they've not had enough people to do the job, and the workload has continued to go up. The second piece is that, again, in my opinion, whether you're ordering guns or butter, the process is pretty much the same. But yet, if you go to the different agencies, there's quite a bit of disparity in terms of grade levels. And I don't know if that's because, it's not necessarily because of the classification system, it's just that decisions that individual agencies are making in terms of what they want to pay salary-wise for those services.
Yeah. Professor, your thoughts? I mean, part of it, you both, Mr. Augustine and Mr. Schooner, talked about the impediments to hiring seasoned veterans into the system and how difficult that is. Any thoughts on how we blend the two? Because we obviously want to protect people from unfair treatment, but at the same token, we want to fire the folks who aren't doing the job they're supposed to be doing.
I think as a premise, I just want to clarify one thing. It is actually remarkable what the existing acquisition workforce has been able to do over the course of the last 2 decades. If you take any publicly available metric for how you would staff a procurement organization, the government is so woefully understaffed, it's breathtaking. But we continue to have the best acquisition regime on the planet. We have wonderful weapons. We have terrific support for our troops. I mean, again, even with all the criticism, if I just use the example of the log cap contract, never before in the history of the planet has a military been able to project such potency, lethality, and sustainability anywhere on the globe with contractor support. It's incomprehensible how many troops we can move and how well supported they are when they fight. And that's because we have an effective contract in place. It has problems at the margin, there's no question. But the amazing thing is that the government is able to do all of the things it needs to do because it relies on contract support, and a very thinly capitalized acquisition workforce every day does amazing things for the government. Now, I think the much larger issue is that we literally spent a couple of decades dealing with the classic tooth-to-tail mix. And there was a strong message from the Congress and from the administration that we needed a smaller military, and therefore we should focus on trigger pullers, not shoppers. That was the Duncan Hunter message for many, many years. Well, now we're paying the price for that. We don't have enough people to manage all the contractors that the government must have every day. But again, I think the important thing to take away from this, the people that we have, they may not be perfect, they may never have been trained appropriately, and we may not have been able to implement all of the policies, but they're doing a remarkable job given the resources they've been given.
The one other, your observations on one other thing. You've got the program managers and folks who actually are evaluated based on how well the things that they do, supervise, do. Is there a scheme that says, all right, let's put in place an evaluation system that evaluates them separate and apart from the results of what they're trying to get done, so that you're looking at evaluation of the system itself? You got a system that's supposed to work, and it's got to evaluate whether or not the contractor or the delivery system is working. But do we properly evaluate the folks for how, even though their program may fail, that may not be a reflection on them, it may be a reflection on something else, so they evaluate it properly.
We should have Norm weigh in on this too, but on program managers, I think one of the most important things, I think we all agree that we can have better incentive schemes for program managers, but if you were going to isolate one problem you have to solve at the Defense Department with regard to the program manager workforce, it's that you gotta leave them in place and let them manage the programs. The last time that I was here with a senior DOD official, they were bragging about the fact that program manager retention was up to 23 months on a program. That's incomprehensible. In the private sector, people spend professional lifetimes guiding programs to success. Until we can do that, we will not be able to achieve what we need done in terms of program management. But I'm sure Norm has stuff to add on that too.
If I might, I would just add that in the private sector, we generally, if I might use an analogy to the bull riding and the rodeo, you get your score is based on two things. One is how well you do, and one is how hard the bull bucked. If you have an easy job and do a great piece of work, you don't get that much credit. And so I think you can distinguish. I'd also, if I might, just add a footnote that with the exception of a few areas, I don't think the answer is to add more people. The answer is to have more experienced people in the job they're in, and the experience needs to be relevant to the job they're doing. If I might quote Dave Packard again, who I think so highly of, it used to trouble him greatly that we would bring the commander of a destroyer flotilla who had done a terrific job at sea and put them in charge of the F-111 program. And they would ruin their career and usually ruin the program. It wasn't fair to them, it wasn't fair to the program, it wasn't fair to the taxpayer, and it sure wasn't fair to the future pilots. And I think that's part of our problem today, that we put people in jobs that they're just not equipped to handle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cooper is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How do we keep program managers in place for longer than 23 months? What steps are required to do that?
This is all about leadership and incentives. Now, I mean, to some extent, you could argue, and again, I think Norm just suggested it before, there's a perception, particularly in the military organizations, that in order to have a program moving forward, you need someone with lots of color on their chest to come in so that they can project leadership and they can make the good sale up here on the hill so that the funding keeps going on. But at the end of the day, what the private sector does much better than the government on this is they develop the right talent within their fields and respect people within those fields. So the message isn't that I need to take a warfighter and turn them into a program manager so that it looks like my program has leadership. We need to value the people who come up through the organization, and then we need to incentivize them to stay by basically developing them so that they can rise up and be important contributors to the system. It's a totally different cultural approach, and I can assure you in the private sector, the program managers who are the civilian or the private sector equivalent with whom the Defense Department program managers deal with every day are incentivized completely differently and are far more incentivized to have those programs succeed than their government counterparts. We can solve these problems.
So is the problem, in order to appeal to Congress, turning a warfighter into a program manager, or is the real problem that that temporary program manager really wants to go back to being a warfighter very quickly, so he or she doesn't stay in that position very long?
I think it's actually a combination of both, but I can just tell you a quick anecdote. As a former Department of Justice litigator, I never represented a program manager in a deposition who didn't tell me in advance that he or she was never given the opportunity to attend the Defense Systems Management College Program Management course before they took over the program because they just didn't have time. So if the marquee course for preparing program managers is something that does not merit the time of the successful kind of people we want to put in charge of the programs, we got a pretty big disconnect going on there.
What would be an appropriate minimum period of time for a program manager to
May
serve?
I
Yeah.
try to address
Sure.
that one? The practice in the industrial world, which I think is reasonably good in this area, is not to keep a program manager in place based on time, but rather on the phase of the program. And a person who may be a very good program manager in a development program probably isn't a very good program manager in the production program or in the original tooling program or in the prototype phase. We used to, in our company, refer to, we had bear catchers, bear skinners, and people who like to sit around the campfire and talk about bears. And so I think the important thing is to leave people in place from one phase of a program to the next phase so that you have somebody who's equipped.
In service records, is their service as a program manager linked to the overall success or lack thereof of the program? Or is that just a temporary assignment? You check your ticket, punch your ticket, and then move on?
I think that's another major difference. In the private sector, to succeed as a program manager, which is a really tough job, is probably one of the best ways to move up into an organization. In the government, the first thing you want to do is get out of program management and get out into a foxhole.
Because that's the best way to be promoted.
Absolutely. And of course, that brings up the whole question, should you have civilian program managers instead of military program managers, which is a major debate in its own right.
Which side do you come down on that debate?
By and large, on the military program manager.
Because they're able to follow it through. I've been worried that while after Goldwater-Nichols we have joint warfighting, we still don't have joint procurement. and sometimes parochial interests can prevail.
That's true.
What should we do about that?
Well, you're talking about a cultural issue, and usually the way to deal with cultural issues like that, and this is probably very hard to do in the military, maybe not in the civilian part of procurement, but is to move people around so they have to live in the different elements. They don't view themselves as, but I guess the joint assignments are that way to a degree, that you don't view yourself as coming from one element of the organization, but rather have experience broadly.
I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, we're glad you got to the bare essentials they were going to say.
I apologize for that, Mr. Chairman.
I apologize for that. Mr. Kaufman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Augustine, one point that Mr. Cooper raised I want to go into, and that is we've often discussed the challenges of military program managers and the fact that it's an assignment for them, and if they're a naval officer, they want to go back into the fleet. If they're a ground commander in the Army or the Marine Corps, they want to return back to a command, because at the end of the day, that's going to get them promoted. And I know we've done some work inside the Armed Services Committee. I know in the Sea Power and Expeditionary Forces Committee I think there was a shipbuilding program where we insisted that there be one military program manager for the duration of the program. I don't know how that's going to affect that individual's career. But could you go into more detail as to why you think it's important to have military versus civilian program managers? Because certainly the military is always going to be there to have input into the program as it progresses.
Well, you touch on this a very difficult issue, and as I said, I come out rather narrowly on the side of the military program manager, and I do that in part because we're building equipment for the military. The military understands the system. Also, they'll have much more, I think, respect and much more impact in dealing in a military organization. Also, frankly, it's very easy to get rid of a military program manager who's not performing. It's very difficult to get rid of a civilian program manager in the government if they're not performing. And I've had the misfortune of having to try to do both, and there's a big difference. I think the key is not so much whether you wear a uniform or not, but whether you've been given the opportunity to really be experienced. And we do have people who have a chaplain's corps, we have a JAG, where those people understand they'll probably never be chief of staff or CNO, but they know if they do their job well, they can move to the top of their organization, which is viewed as a very important thing. Somehow we haven't conveyed that in the acquisition area. Partly, as has been pointed out, acquisition is viewed as when anything goes wrong, it must be for a criminal intent.
You mentioned a concern about, and I share your concern about the declining industrial base in the United States, and certainly we can go into a lot of reasons for that, tax, regulatory policies, and things like that. But let's focus on one specific issue, in that some of the contractors have mentioned to me the limitations in terms of their ability to export their technologies that they develop, that other countries don't have those restrictions. And if we go on simply too far on those restrictions, then we need to loosen them up so that our industrial base has a broader market than just the United States Defense Department.
I think that's absolutely the case. Most of our import-export regulations were written many, many years ago in a world where we controlled the technology,
Okay.
Where you really could build a border around the country, neither of which are true today.
Okay.
I would commend you. I chaired a Commerce Department study on this about a year ago, and I would commend that to you.
Okay.
Also one by General Scowcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that that's something that I know it's sort of off, maybe a little off the reservation of what the committee, but I think it's something that we ought to look at.
If the gentleman will yield, I don't think it is off the reservation.
Okay.
I think it's an excellent point that there are both national security and economic aspects to the export control debate. And of course, the economic concerns are implicitly a national security concern as well. The obvious national security concern is we don't want to share sensitive intelligence with someone who may not be friendly to us. But the other national security concern is that if intelligent export policy helps us sustain our industrial base, it improves our national security. And I think that's something we really should address in our report. I'd like to thank the witnesses and actually impose upon them another duty if I could. Mr. Conaway and I appreciate the efforts of the staff, which has done an extraordinarily good job in creating a draft report that summarizes our work and makes recommendations. That draft report was distributed to the members of the panel yesterday. The members of the panel will be meeting next week to review it and hone it. And Mr. Kaufman and I had a discussion earlier today. I would note to the staff members of the other panel present, more suggestions are absolutely welcome. That's why it's called a draft. But we would like to give you that draft report, the three of you, so that you would then have a homework assignment of taking a look at it and giving us some input. The panel is going to meet in a business session next week to review the draft. We're then going to have public circulation of the draft and another hearing of the panel where we're going to have Defense Department and other witnesses comment on it. But we would welcome your specific comments as well as we go forward. I think the perspectives that you've given us here today are very valuable. What we've learned in our year working on this is that the superficial questions are rather easily answered. But when you get below the superficial level, these are very complex issues, but I do think they're solvable issues. One recurring theme has been leadership and the quality of the workforce. I think we've heard today from all three witnesses that if you make the proper investment in experience and skill, if you motivate and reward experienced and skilled people, if you empower them to do the things that need to be done, we can make improvements that would then turn the whole system around. The other lesson that I think we've learned is that when you're purchasing $300 billion a year worth of goods and services, apart from major weapon systems, almost $300 billion a year, everything ranging from cases of water to elaborate pieces of software, that one size most assuredly does not fit all. And we certainly will not be rendering a report that suggests that one procurement system or one set of rules is the way to do this. I will tip our hand a little bit and tell you that my own bias is that more rules and more proscriptive mandates from the Congress is going to exacerbate the problem, not solve it. And so what we're looking to do here, a way to do, is to give intelligent principles and concepts, then put in place intelligent, experienced people to execute those concepts, and then reward them when they do. And I think if I could summarize what we're going to propose, that's about it. So if we can do that with your good graces, we'd like that. So I would invite you to take a look at the draft report. It will be publicly available soon, and we would welcome your input. Mr. Conaway, did you have any closing comments? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. With that, the hearing is adjourned.